Hello, good evening. Thanks for joining us again. Today I'm going to be going through the lungs, how ventilation occurs, how surface tension works, Laplace's law, alveolar gas exchange, and the transport of CO2 and oxygen in the blood. We're going to cover it all. So let's go ahead and get started. I wanted to get started with negative pressure ventilation. What is negative pressure ventilation? What it is um, the negative pressure in something we call the pleural space, which is around they're surrounding the alveoli, and we're able to um, we're able to ventilate with the negative pressure because the pressure is less than outside of the alveoli. That helps keep them open. So let me just demonstrate that here. So we have our lungs, trachea, and then we're gonna have another membrane on the outside, and then outside that we'll have some ribs drawn to show that this is the thoracic cavity. Okay, and then down here we have the diaphragm. This layer right here is going to be called our visceral pleura. This layer right here is our parietal pleura. And this area in between them is called the pleural space. Um, so these are some of the membranes involved, and then here we have our diaphragm. So let's just go through a couple different pressures. So out here we have atmospheric pressure, which is 760 millimeters of mercury. And inside the lungs, depending on whether we are inhaling or exhaling, we'll have a different pressure compared to that 760, but it's going to hover around that. And that has something to do with something we call Boyle's law. It basically says increased volume equals decreased pressure, and decreased volume equals increased pressure. So, like I was saying before, as the diaphragm contracts and goes down, I guess I can just erase this right here. Oh, just erase this. Our lungs are going to follow and increase their volume. As the volume increases, the pressure is going to decrease. And so if our pressure inside the lungs, say it's 745, and that's less than the outside, air is going to have to come in to the lungs. Now, when the diaphragm rests and it pushes upwards, our lungs will go back to how they were before. Their volume will decrease. Diaphragm pushes up, and our pressure, because the volume goes down, the pressure will increase. So say it's 765 now. That's going to push air out until it is balanced. So that is what makes negative pressure ventilation possible. Now, the reason we say negative pressure is because a lot of times we'll be referring to this 760 right here as 0 millimeters of mercury because it's the set point. So whatever your pressure is outside is whatever the atmospheric pressure is where you are would be 0. Relative to that, the lungs here will either get negative or positive. Negative to inhale, positive to exhale. And something that happens with the alveoli is that when they get negative pressure, something that keeps them from collapsing and being able to exhale is going to be the pleural space, and it's negative 4 millimeters of mercury. The way that it's able to maintain that negative 4 is because there's lymph nodes that are going in and sucking out any fluid that is in the pleural space. So the lung and both the pleura are sticking to each other because of that. Now, what are some issues we can go through? There's something called pneumothorax. Pneumothorax is going to happen when we've got some sort of puncture in one of the pleural membranes. So, say there's a gunshot wound, hits the parietal pleura, all of a sudden air is able to come into this pleural space. What's going to happen? Well, that's going to put pressure on the lung, and it's going to cause the lung to begin to collapse. So the area within the pleural space is now going to increase and be filled with air. That is a problem because since that negative pressure is gone, we can no longer do negative pressure ventilation. So using that lung is completely impossible. We're not able to inhale, we're not able to get gas exchange, and in some cases it will affect the venous return to the heart, to the left side of the heart, with oxygenated blood. So it can even cause death in some cases. So it is not good. Another thing that we can have is something called pleuritis. So we'll have some sort of inflammation in the pleural space. They'll rub against each other, and it can cause big inflammation in these membranes here and cause the pleural space to enlarge, also causing sort of a mini pneumothorax. So that's one problem we can have. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the alveoli. So each lung has a ton of alveoli. I'm just going to draw 2 here. And each of them are slightly different shapes and sizes, but they all kind of look like this. Anatomically correct, of course. And each little alveoli is going to have this lining of water. Now, water is attracted to itself, so that is what's keeping this lining all together here. But there's also an attractive force inwards to other water. What that is called is surface tension. Now, on one hand, it is good that we have surface tension because it's giving us elasticity to the lung. It's helping the lung be able to push out air when it's inhaled. But there is a problem that comes up with this surface tension because as the water here, as the radius of the alveolus gets smaller and smaller, the surface tension increases because the water gets closer and closer to itself. So something that the alveoli will release and put inside the water is these things called surfactant. Erase these arrows here. Surfactant. Surfactant is interesting because it can come in many different forms, but it always has one end that is hydrophilic, which means it likes water, and then one end that is hydrophobic, doesn't like water. So obviously the hydrophilic end will be facing towards the water, and then the hydrophobic ends will all be facing away from the water. This surfactant helps maintain and keep the surface tension from collapsing one of our alveoli here. So that is very important. And like I mentioned, the smaller our radius gets, the more surface tension we're going to have, so the more surfactant we're going to need. And that a helpful equation for that is P. This is called Laplace's law. Let me write that. It's P equals 2T over R. So R is going to be our radius of the alveolus. T is going to be our surface tension. And P is our pressure within the alveolus. So whatever pressure there is in the alveolus, it needs to be countered when we're exhaling. It needs to be countered by surfactant, so that it does not collapse. So this brings us to our next part. Let me see. What happens if we have a lack of surfactant? So like I said, if we were to get rid of this surfactant, the water, when it gets close together, is going to be attracted and it will collapse on itself. One example of this is called what is it called? Infant respiratory distress syndrome. That's what it's called. So RDS. And what happens during RDS is babies who are born too early may not have produced enough surfactant yet to be able to breathe without their alveoli collapsing. So the surfactant is one of the last things that's produced because the baby's obviously not breathing while it's in the womb. So some of the different things that they can do to be able to help with this is by putting the baby on a ventilator to increase pressure going into the lungs and increase oxygen. Also doing surfactant therapy, but a lot of times babies, if the doctor knows that the baby's going to be born early, they can give the mom some steroids that will help the baby speed up the surfactant production so it's able to breathe when it's born. So usually able to stop this. Sometimes can be fatal though. So you definitely want to have that surfactant in your alveoli. Next, let's go on to the alveolar gas equation over here. The alveolar gas equation is the pressure of the alveolar oxygen equals the, put a parenthesis here, FiO2 times atmospheric pressure minus H2O minus PaCO2 over R. Okay, so let's explain some of these variables. So this is the alveolar pressure of O2. This is the fractional concentration of inspired oxygen. This is atmospheric pressure. This is going to be our water vapor pressure. And then our arterial pressure of CO2. And then R is going to be our respiratory exchange ratio. And that's usually going to be about 0.85. This is going to be 40. Water vapor pressure is usually about 47. Atmospheric is 760. And then this fractional, this is about 0.21. This is the fraction of the air that we breathe in that's oxygen. So obviously most of it's nitrogen, but then 0.21% or 0.21 out of 1 is oxygen. Using all this, we should be able to calculate what our PaO2, our alveolar pressure of oxygen, which should be identical to our arterial pressure of oxygen. And one of the things that we can use the alveolar gas equation is to find that oxygen pressure in both the alveolus and the arterioles. They should be equal. Usually we can use the equation to find the one in the alveolus, and then to find the arterial one we can measure it. If the values are really different, we know that something is messing up the gas exchange. Something is going on, and we need to fix it. So that brings us to gas exchange. Gas exchange. So CO2 and O2 are going to be transported in the blood in different ways. Let's start out with oxygen. So about 2% of O2 is going to be transported, dissolved in the blood. The rest, the 98%, is going to be transported by hemoglobin. Meanwhile, CO2, it has a couple different ways of being transported. Let me find this. Okay, so 7% of CO2 is just dissolved in the blood. 23% is bound to the amino acid on the amino acid on the globin portion of hemoglobin. So a different spot than where the oxygen is bound to. And then 70% is going to be dissolved in the blood as HCO3 minus, or bicarbonate. So those are the different ways of transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood. Now let's draw a blood cell here with our nice hemoglobin. Each hemoglobin is able to carry 4 oxygens. And this brings us to a different, something about like the conformation of hemoglobin. The hemoglobin has an iron molecule. That's what helps the oxygens bind to it. And it's going to have 2 different states called the R state and the T state. So let's just draw our hemoglobin right here. Actually, wait, let me draw it in a different color. So inside here we have hemoglobin. Oh. Out here we have the iron. Iron is bound to O2. This is what we call the R state because iron is reaching for oxygen, or also the relaxed state. The next one we have is called the T state, or the tense state. And here we have an amino acid called histidine that is pulling the iron down, and it's making it so that it's not able to bind to oxygen. Also on the side here, we can have a CO2 bound that can affect the affinity for oxygen of the hemoglobin. Anyways, there's this graph that I want to look at called the hemoglobin curve, but let me just look here. Something called the oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. A little like this. Let me see. So this is our oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Down here we have the arterial pressure of oxygen. And then over here we have the percent saturation of hemoglobin. So as you can see, as we go along this curve, So we start our saturation is increasing with very little increase in pressure in O2, but once we hit a certain point, it starts to flatten out, and it takes more and more oxygen pressure to saturate our hemoglobin because almost all of it is saturated. We have a couple different important points. Let's just mark this here. This is about 40 millimeters of mercury, and then up here is 102 millimeters of mercury. Now at the lungs, where gas exchange is occurring, our oxygen pressure should be 102 millimeters of mercury. That's about the normal range. So that, we'll just mark this here as like the lungs, at lungs. And then say we're working really hard, we're doing exercise, and our tissues are really low on oxygen. Our pressure of oxygen is going to be lower, around like 20. And so here we would say in tissues. Now, why is this important? Well, as the saturation, or as the pressure of oxygen in the blood increases, the saturation of our hemoglobin is also going to increase. But if the pressure of oxygen in the blood decreases, our hemoglobin is going to release the oxygen that is bound to it. So that brings us to the factors that affect this curve. So the first one, let me just find it. Okay, yeah. So the first one is the arterial pressure of oxygen. So the lower the arterial pressure of oxygen, less hemoglobin will want to pick up oxygen. It wants to get rid of it. If there's low pressure of oxygen in the blood, that means hemoglobin needs to release it. It needs to give it to that tissue that needs it because of hypoxia or whatever. When oxygen leaves hemoglobin, it actually enters the T state, which is the tense state, and it actually makes nearby heme groups have less affinity for oxygen. So that is one factor. The second factor is going to be the pH of the blood. So H plus ions actually can bind to hemoglobin and replace and cause it to move towards the T state, causing heme to have less affinity for oxygen. So more acidic blood or lower pH means lower oxygen affinity. One example of this would be when you're working out, your tissues are going to be releasing lactic acid. This is to take up spots on the hemoglobin so that oxygen gets knocked off, more oxygen is released and is able to be absorbed by the tissues. And that's something we call the Bohr effect. Number 3, temperature. An increased temperature is going to cause a lower affinity for oxygen. Oxygen is going to be released more when the temperature is increased. So if we have increased temperature, for example, in a muscle that's exercising, it needs more oxygen. It's going to be released. And then another is a molecule called 2,3-diphosphoglycerate. This molecule is produced during times of hypoxia, and it also is going to bind to the heme, cause it to go into the T state, and cause more release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. The last Actually, I think that's all of our factors we wanted to go through. I also will say this, a fifth factor that can affect it is CO2, or the pressure, the arterial pressure of CO2. CO2 has the ability to bind itself to hemoglobin, causing it to go into the T state, causing oxygen to be released. Now, the inverse is true with carbon dioxide. If carbon dioxide, the inverse is true at the lungs. So at the lungs, a lot of oxygen is being dumped into the bloodstream. What happens is oxygen is going to bind to these heme groups because there's so much of it, and that is actually going to kick this carbon dioxide. It's going to kick it off. When that carbon dioxide is kicked off of all those heme groups, it's going to actually go back into the lungs and be breathed out. So that is how that works. Now let's talk about things that can shift the curve, because this curve can actually change. Say we shift our curve to the right, or to the left, sorry. If this curve is shifted to the left, what does that mean? That means that the percentage of hemoglobin that's saturated with oxygen is increased per pressure unit of oxygen. So this would mean that there's not as much acid in the blood. There's a higher pH. This is going to mean that the temperature maybe is lower. Oxygen is going to have a higher affinity. So let's say increase pH, which means decrease in CO2 and also a decrease in temperature. Also, there would be a decrease in our 2,3-biphosphoglycerate. Now, let's look at the opposite. If we draw a new line underneath, say the line shifted to the right, what does that mean? It means that per unit of pressure of oxygen, the saturation is lower than normal. That means that there's probably more acid in our blood. So we're going to have a lower pH, we're going to have higher CO2, higher temp. So lower pH, higher CO2, higher temp, higher production of 2,3-biphosphoglycerate, so that our oxygen can be released to those tissues. So that's usually during times of hypoxia or during exercise. One good way to remember all of these factors that affect is cadet. C stands for CO2, A stands for acidic pH, D stands for the 2,3-diphosphoglycerate, E stands for exercise, and T stands for temperature. So that's a good way to remember it. Let's see. Yeah, so I think we've covered everything here. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day. We will catch